Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hi, and welcome back to our 1,000-part analysis.
Chapter 1, Part 1, Subsection 5.
One part for every face.
Yeah, the hero with 1,000 faces. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Stephen Ramosi.
Hello?
And Scott Thurlow.
Hey there.
All right, so in our second section of this analysis, we are going over Chapter 1, which is titled The Departure of Part 1, which is
Adventure of the Hero.
So we are reviewing this and analyzing this without having read the entirety of the book. As we mentioned in the Part 1, the monomyth. Mm-hmm. As we're going through, we are so we're going to be, in a sense, like, we might make commentary on things he solves later, but these are issues that are just as come up while we're reading it. Sure. So I just want to bring up so speaking of which, I want to bring up a quick thing. The Hero with 1,000 Faces has been referenced a lot through my time in studying
Touted
narrative.
as a seminal work, I guess I'll phrase it as.
And I don't think it necessarily lives up yet to the accolades it is given. In that, when you read his work, it's divided into, I think, 3 parts. One, the very tiny sliver of actual theory. 2, the foundational, kind of Freudian psychology that he's kind of justifying his theories with. And then the majority of the parts are examples from
various myths. Yeah.
It feels more like a compendium of mythology than it does an analysis of it, more so than not.
I largely agree. So we were speaking briefly precast before this episode that, yes, while we acknowledge, and as I said, it's touted as sort of one of the, if not the seminal work upon this subject, and maybe it's just an artifact of us reading it in our day and age versus when it was originally published in 48 or 9, I believe. It's just that I wasn't as impressed. It is solid enough at certain times, I guess I'll say. But at other times, I just don't see why its influence is so broad. But kind of at the same time, I do. I just wasn't as impressed, like I said, so far, having read what we've read.
Well, I mean, I guess, so to defend the book a little bit here, I guess, do you guys feel like you know what this book is saying?
Kind of, yes.
Well, that's because this book
of the book
exists.
Right? I get that. Steve, also, certainly, that's a very valid point. So, sure. I'm just saying, having read the analysis, like I said, the gap of time between now and then is perhaps we were just immersed in this stuff already because this book existed.
I feel like, especially since Star Wars was the really big breakout of this book becoming coming to the forefront, I think, of what it is to tell a story. And I think the important thing about this book is it collects all those myths and things from very different cultures and shows how they are all the same, how a story is told the same way. And the reason that there's so many examples is because there are a lot of examples, and that's exactly what he's trying to prove, that a story is a story and it works the same way in every culture.
So I have 2 last comments to make about this. One is that it was probably so influential to its own detriment as it aged that
perhaps
it became,
yes.
Oh, of course, just we're making a point that's so obvious, but he might not have been obvious at the time. But the second part I want to say is, I forgot the second part, so we'll get back to that if I remember it. Anyway, do you have any guys have anything?
No, I mean, I just want you and I agreed. I sort of had to point that out just at the outset that yes, while it was very solid, and I think you're right about that, Sivo, what you just said, certainly, just that, again, taken at face value, when I was reading it, I didn't feel it was as in-depth as it's proclaimed to be, but perhaps that's because the nature of it and that it's so immersed in everything we've studied since.
Sure. I mean, and I've, like I said in the first episode of this, I've started reading this book years ago, and I never finished it, but reading it again, reading this part again, it is, it is nice to go through and kind of like, I don't think Campbell is trying to like inundate you with his philosophy of how a story should work. What he's trying to do is show you how stories do work, and that's why it's all examples and less explanation, I guess.
I do now remember my second point, which was that I feel that this is a pretty lengthy work, and I feel that if you only took out the points he was trying to make with removing his examples of those points and like the kind of Freud thing, it would be maybe a 40-page paper in total. So far, at least.
Maybe, but like
sure, and that, I mean, that's going to continue. Don't get your hopes up that it's going to change.
No, I get it. Like, but certainly he set the tone. Given that.
So, without further ado, then we will depart on our own adventure with section 1, which is the call to adventure. Now, he goes back to a couple of the themes he developed in the preface, which was the monomyth, with the idea of like the cyclical nature of birth, rebirth, and death.
Right.
And he kind of describes how oftentimes a myth will begin in a very familiar world, and a herald will arrive to signify the division between, like, or in a sense, give the call to adventure, but also signify the division between what is known and what is unknown. Right. To use a Freudian term here, it brings upon the uncanny.
Now, that's the thing I was going to point out, which we'll speak about as we go on, and I think you briefly mentioned it, if not in part 1, I'll mention it here, that Campbell uses a lot of Freudian analysis, which, again, nowadays, I think holds less water, at least to me. So while, again, when he brings up Freud or like examples from psychoanalysis as applied to myth and storytelling and so forth, I just don't know if it's as credible in my own mind nowadays.
I mean, I kind of tried to gloss over, for the most part, the Freud points.
Literally the first note I have about this part is Freud mentioned again.
Yeah, and he does bring up Freud. He does bring up Freud and Jung quite a bit. But I think that you can... I feel like, in reading this, I feel like the parts that were the most Freud heavy were also the shortest chapters because they were saying the least.
Sure, exactly. That's kind of my point.
And I think that he realized that too, but it's tough to, especially at the time that he was writing this, it's tough to talk about, like, to psychoanalyze a story like this without bringing up Freud.
See, it also really has to deal with the scope of the story. And he makes a point of saying that the call to adventure doesn't have to be something amazingly epic. It can be, in a sense, the growth of an individual.
Sure, a journey of self-realization, kind of.
And in a way, like the Frog Prince, which he uses quite often in this, was in a sense, there is actually a kind of a psychological aspect of it. Well, again, this is just one example, which Freud does kind of figure in, but the idea of the development and growth of a young female.
Sure.
And how, like, all these aspects kind of can fit in with psychology. Whether one example makes a greater theory can be debated, but I think that there is a psychological aspect to certain myths. I'm
not arguing that. I'm just saying, like, it seems as if he mentioned it more than was necessary, at least to me, like, in a certain sense. But yeah, certainly there's validity to it at the core at the same time. So
I would like to point out, since you pointed out that he brings up the Frog Prince a bunch, I would like to point out that I really like that in his examples, he continues on with telling the stories that he had started in previous ones, showing that they hit this mark, they hit this mark. Some of them trail off, or like some of them end at a certain point, and then he continues on with other ones.
You're right, Steve, but that's a good stylistic choice. I agree.
And one other thing I wanted to talk about on the Call to Adventure before we wrap this part up is that his how he points out that this can often be a series of signs that are increasing in force until the call can no longer, quote unquote, no longer be ignored.
Right.
Well, that's a great segue, but so I will cut off your segue. But I think the important points to know in the call to adventure,
your adventure is being interrupted,
is the herald and essentially the call to adventure itself. Mm-hmm. And those are the points that he emphasizes in the first section. The second section is the refusal of the call.
Right.
Which I actually have a lot of nitpicks with this section.
Okay.
But speaking of, or as I like to call it, the "but thou must" section.
I knew you were going to say that because I thought that same thing while reading this.
But here he does bring up, again, Freud with the idea that to deny the adventure is the refusal to give up on like these kind of Freudian fixations.
You're like clinging to,
the clinging to youth, the clinging to certain
clinging
aspects
to the womb.
Yes.
Yes, thanks, Freud.
But
he also points out like what happens when you refuse the call, and it's like causing a life of pain, and
sort of. Because there's 3 types of refusals of the call.
Oh, I was going to point out another one as well.
No, but you have to see them in context with each other. The first one is, as you just mentioned, the refusal of the call brings you pain, except if you were, in a sense, destined to refuse the call, thus becoming the not the herald itself, but like the MacGuffin, if you will,
destined to be saved.
Or if you are destined to refuse the call as part of a bigger call and achieve a light.
It's like the red herring of call to adventure.
Yeah.
So I have a call to adventure, but I don't know if I should deny it or not. If I deny it, it could be really bad, but it could also be really good. Campbell did not instruct me.
Hey man, this book isn't about life. It's about stories.
I guess not a guide to it, but I have one.
Do whatever you want.
I do have one final note that like sort of related to that like another sort of like 2A aspect that he points out is that refusing the call is sort of like, again, a la Freudian psychoanalysis, is sort of a self-imposed kind of rejection. Like, again, like clinging to earlier mindsets and desires and so forth, and not breaking out of those. So that's all. That's basically, I think, this section points out.
Yeah, sometimes people refuse a call.
Sure. But sometimes a call is just a call, I suppose.
The problem I have with this is it kind of breaks the universal quality of what he's trying. He's trying to create a universal like
template.
Yeah, a structure to these myths, and then he's saying that anything goes when it comes to this section. And
I think the big point of this, actually, I'm glad you said that. I think the big point of this is that the refusal to call can be the end of a story, but it can also be a continuation if you are destined to be saved or destined to refuse that call so as to take a higher calling or whatever like that. So I think honestly every single one of these sections can be the end of a story. Even the call to adventure is a story in and of itself.
Sure. That's a good point.
In some way.
I do like that interpretation.
So I had an interesting thought here as my final thing of waiting for Godot, which is people waiting to answer a call
that never comes.
That just ain't coming.
So
I guess he didn't account for that for Beckett, but whatever.
Yeah, Campbell did not account for Beckett. Anyway, so part 3 is the spiritual aid.
I got supernatural aid in my copy.
That could be. I could have just misread.
Anyway,
supernatural aid, where I actually think this is the manifestation of destiny's desire to be fulfilled, which is
yes, I like that phrase.
It's the start of when someone accepts the call to adventure, they'll meet generally a protective elder who bestows a boon.
I've got very often magical elderly figure, exactly.
Magical old man or magical old woman,
or the plot armor of destiny.
Yes, that's pretty good too. I like that.
Yep.
But yeah, it's basically that. Again, usually an elderly individual, whether it's be like an old crone or the wise and sage, kind of gives the blessing to go off.
Yeah,
I don't have anything else.
Once that figure appears, whatever it may be, that then you know that in fact you've answered the right call to the right adventure. I suppose.
Yeah, I mean it's basically it's like the small, like, boon, for lack of a better term,
yes, I think
that you're going to need to get
that term.
That you're going to need to get through beginning stages of your adventure.
Exactly.
If you're going on an epic adventure, or perhaps it's the boon that you're going to need to get through your regular adventure, your standard normal
or your
adventure
journey of self-discovery. But either way,
right?
I think there's one last point he makes in here where you can the adventurer might not even believe in the kind of the supernatural aspect to it, but it's bestowed anyway. It's like the kind of they think they're denying it, but again, this goes back to the idea of destiny desire. Like this destiny desires to be fulfilled. It's given anyway.
And just remember, you can equate all of this to Star Wars.
For sure. But no, like, so actually that's kind of funny. Like, something related to that I have in my notes, sort of again going back to Freudian, or actually in this instance a more Jungian connection, which I more gravitate towards. It's if not supernatural aid, you can sort of like, he mentions, I think, in a passage where you can get it from your dreams. Like, your dreams are your supernatural aid on this given quest. So just want to mention that, and I think that's it for this section.
So then section 4 is the crossing of the first threshold, or here be dragons.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I like this because it's in a sense the first trial that delineates the border between what he uses, like different terms of this, but I want to say civilization and the familiar, between like in a sense the wild and the unknown.
Exactly. I have a very similar note.
Wolves out there.
But that's where it gets really interesting. And I actually liked this section the best of all the original ones because it kind of delves into how the personal nature of the first threshold and how the monster can be different.
Right.
And I like how a lot of these monsters, as they are reflections of what, in a sense, civilization fears about individualism.
Yep. Freudian again, but I think it's still definitely valid.
I don't necessarily know if that's Freudian. I think that's
we'll
more
discuss
like,
in a second.
Yeah,
you finish and I'll give my comment.
For instance, like the ogre or like the wolf, the predatory nature of the individual on the outskirts of society, or if you do for the like women, you have the nymphs, or like if you just want to do sexuality, you have like the satyrs and all of that,
the unknown,
who are who give into. It's basically giving. The first one is a reflection of the hero's kind of bestial nature.
Yeah,
sure. Yes, I definitely got that out of this section, and I agree. And so I have two like somewhat humorous notes. So oftentimes there will be a guardian,
right,
that that you must pass or overcome, etc., to cross the first threshold. And I have, of course, video game style. It's a mini boss. It's your first, your first mini boss battle. Yeah. And since we brought up, like, again, we've been variously mentioning it begrudgingly, Freud, of course, is the threshold guardian of all modern analysis.
At least when it comes to narrative.
You get past Freud before you get to...
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but here's where I can actually, though, see. I know you were saying that humorously, but the idea is that if you leave the protective, like, enclave that is society,
sure,
the first monster is you rejecting that wild and still staying, in a sense, what mythologically these people would consider to be human.
Right.
And
sure, no, that's a very good point.
It's a very like neat kind of social commentary there.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of that threshold guardian. It doesn't even have to be something that's against you. It can be something that is looking out for you, trying to keep you quote unquote safe, or you, the hero, whoever it is, the character in the story, trying to keep them safe. But that hero has to break past that in order to have this greater adventure. I think that's an interesting thing.
You're right. Actually, that did make me remember something. So, like I said, there's a guardian figure that protects the threshold. There's also like a protectorial figure, which like it's either a challenger or again like a figure beyond what we just said about the supernatural aid. But nevertheless, there's like a barrier there, as represented by something like that you, again, the hero, or as you said, the hero must overcome to cross, like, in order to, in fact, cross the first threshold of their journey.
This actually reminds me of, I mean, we're going to bring this up in an episode of Syntax Error, but it reminds me of the guards posted at the outside of town
exactly.
in Hyperlight Drifter.
Yes, or any game like that,
or any RPG really. Like
exactly.
Somebody always there, sitting there, waiting, warning you,
right,
don't go outside.
That's pretty good too. That's kind of what I had in mind. Like
Zelda, like any of the Zelda games.
Yeah, like Zelda actually has a perfect example of an earlier one, which is spiritual aid. Here, take when he hands the sword, take this. Don't go.
It's dangerous to go alone.
Yeah.
An old man gives you a sword in a cave. Sure.
There's a guy in
Hyperlight?
No, in Zelda, the N64, the first
Ocarina of Time?
In Ocarina, when you try to go out of town, at first you're stopped by a guardian
of course, yes.
who stops you until you're quote unquote ready to go, you know?
So, I mean, it is a very influential, and I would actually, at the end of this, would like to go back for more commentary on, like, examples, but let's just finish off with number 5, which is the belly of the whale, which is dealing with perhaps the most Freudian thing in this
for
thing,
sure.
Which is, to cross the threshold, you must kill yourself.
You must journey inward.
Or kill your ego.
Into yourself, yes.
Yeah. Right.
And about how the whale represents the womb and all these aspects of it. But this perhaps is, if this were a structure or a template, this would be in parentheses optional when it comes
side
to
quest.
Yeah. No, but like the idea is that you don't. This is something that you see in a number of different myths, but is not a universal thing. There's just kind of this happens in enough of them that it warrants commentary.
Sure. I mean, yeah, exactly. It's present in a large majority, although not all. And I think that's a subtle but perhaps important difference. I agree with that. And so, in my notes, I wrote down it's more of a sort of a symbolic imagery, as you guys said. Like, there's a certain aspect of self-annihilation that must come in order to move a step forward for self-realization or self-actualization, which is why I got out of this section.
I have a paraphrase. I mean, it may be a direct quote, it may be a paraphrase, but I wrote this down in my notes that it's a transit into a sphere of rebirth, which I thought
that sounds like a Campbell. That's pretty sure he wrote that. But sure, I mean, it's a good description.
But like, it's to some degree, to a lesser or greater degree, I think this is realized in most stories that follow this myth cycle, I guess. It's the story of like self-annihilation. After passing a threshold, yourself is different than it was before.
Sure.
It's a destruction of what you were before and a reimagining of what you are going forward.
Sure, think of it this way. You sort of have to fight like an outward, like external force, right. And then you sort of face yourself inwardly, kind of as represented by the belly of the whale.
Granted, it's not always going to be like really, it's not really going to be like nailed home as like a rebirth thing, but I think there's always that idea of like, there's a point in the story where the hero is different than he was before that.
Exactly.
I think it's the crossing of the first threshold results in a because the idea is that them being different events. I don't know if Joseph Campbell intended that message across, and upon reflection, he probably didn't. But I would think that the crossing of the first threshold will
entails that.
Yeah, it's one and the same, but like not always to the extent that the belly of the whale suggested.
Well, that was Steve was saying.
I would say that is the case, but where I'll defend belly of the belly of the whale section is that the crossing of the first threshold is still the quote unquote hero as everything that he or she has always been up to that point, whereas the belly of the whale section is
an inward reflection.
You finding out what the hero has become.
Then would you say that this is a fair example that the belly of this doesn't have a strict ordering to it, and that it may not be in the
I think it's more fluid,
of the belly of the whale, because I can think of a lot of examples where that rebirth that he's discussing here doesn't happen until like the final, right before the final challenge.
Sure, I do agree with that. Yeah, I think it's more like, as you said, it's not like you have to be like step 1 X Y Z. Like it can be like sort of interwoven in between some of those.
Sure, that can be fluid. I agree with that. Yeah,
I guess that's the difficulty of writing a book like this, is that it has to have a linear nature when
in fact the nature of myths we're not quite sure.
yeah.
But this is the first chapter, the departure. Do any of you guys have any commentary on like examples of these themes throughout?
No, I mean, well, he uses a number of examples, like we said, and while I thought they were well chosen and well explained throughout, it's just that maybe I wanted something more. Again, it's hard to put my finger on. And again, we went over like our sort of gripes in the beginning, and everything else is perfectly fine. It's just that I understood his main points perfectly well. They were perfectly clear, and the examples he used, I thought, like I said, made sense. It's just that maybe I thought there was going to be more depth to it, but not to say there was no depth at all. Just maybe as it goes on, he'll flesh it out. So again, I can't comment upon that per se, but I enjoyed the departure or this section well enough, and I thought it was a good setup, and he set out what his major, at least, theories and thesis were, and tied them all together pretty well.
I do have one quick comment to make, and I believe it was in The Refusal of the Call, where he kind of uses circular logic a little bit where he'll...
Yeah, you and I did notice that. We talked about it precast.
Where he'll look at Greek myths and say that, like, Narcissus like drowned in the pool while looking at the reflection. Obviously, this is an example of narcissistic personality as Freud described it. And it's like, well, but it was also developed partially off of this idea.
That's where the name comes from.
That disorder, in fact, derives from the myth of the character.
So it seemed... Yeah, it doesn't do it very often, but there's a couple of times it does use like kind of...
I think that's the most notable example, like the most obvious one, but sure.
I will say, I guess we should list a couple of the examples that he uses, because I don't think we talked about them at all, but he uses a lot of religious stories, right. Catholicism, Islam, Buddhist
myths,
stories, Jewish stories. He uses a lot of... that's actually... where he gets a lot of his myths from. There are also some like in, I believe you mentioned the Frog Prince.
Yeah, King Arthur he uses as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of that type of stuff, but for the most part, I think it's pretty much going back in their like religious myths and because they're the most well known, I think, is why he goes into those a lot.
In a sense.
I think it's the 1001 Nights.
Yep, the Arabian Nights.
He uses a number of stories from that throughout.
He does.
So he does try to get... While he's trying to make a universal theory, he does do a good job of...
choosing a wide variety of myths. Yep, sure.
Yeah. And I think for the next episode, I'm going to try and come up with some more modern day examples. I didn't write a lot down, so like I'm trying to think of some as I go along. But
you mentioned Star Wars earlier,
which
is very famous.
I guess we should discuss that briefly. Sure. George Lucas basically based Star Wars off of this book. He was a disciple of Joseph Campbell. They met several times, and I think Campbell basically was his mentor for a while.
Gave him a bunch of ideas, at least for the core story.
Yeah, and you can watch Star Wars and tick down on the list. Like you can just check off like marks of every single section of this. So if you want to see something that specifically uses this as like a guideline to how to write a story, you can go look at Star Wars.
In fact, my copy of Hero 1000 Faces has a picture of Skywalker on the front of it.
Awesome.
It has like the old ancient like depictions like freezes and then that.
So Star Wars is a really good one. Like I just mentioned, Zelda pulls a lot. Like the Zelda games pull.
Certainly, Zelda's a hero's journey story.
Those epic hero journey type of feel.
I mean, any kind of like you can look and find elements of like Lord of the Rings.
Yep. Absolutely.
I think that Matrix borrowed a lot from this.
Sure.
As well.
Of course, like you said, its reach is far and wide. It's just that we've been so immersed in things that like perhaps pulled from it that maybe we didn't realize it. Or at least I was like, I know that bucket of truth, but there wouldn't be no bucket of truth without this book.
Right. Or I'm going to say that perhaps it is, and I don't think it diminishes the intent of it, but maybe he's trying to make such broad generalizations that you can find an element of this in almost anything.
Well, it is.
That's exactly the point.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what the book is.
I don't know. It seems that people who promoted it said that had more depth to it than it. And I don't begrudge broad generalizations. That's fine. But at that point, it becomes, I don't want to say shallow, because that's not what it's going for here, but it becomes less meaty than I would like the discussion.
No, I mean, I broadly agree, but again, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And in fact, it was an interesting read. just that, we are who we are existing at the time and the place, removed from the original publication. But that's kind of the whole point, is what you're saying.
Well, you guys are in for a slog, because this whole book is this exact same way.
I didn't feel like it was a slog either. Yeah. I don't want to use that term at all.
All right.
Just that, I said what I said about it, and that's just the feeling I got when I was reading.
I'm becoming far more well-versed in, fables.
I love that part of it, too. Like, I learn a lot, and I forgot a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
Since last time
that might be the most interesting part.
I really enjoyed reading a lot of these myths and, old fables and things like that.
We're done with the second episode of our analysis of The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Next time, we'll be discussing more of the Call to Adventure, Part 1. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, and I am refusing the Call to Adventure here with Sivan Ramosi, who will be my spiritual aid.
But aren't you here discussing the adventure with us right now?
And stuck in the belly of the whale because he failed to cross the first threshold, Scott Tola.
Always. I'll be here forever. Good night. See you next time.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course.
Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.